Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to another educational session on the Beezone. And tonight in our studio, we have a very, very special guest, and she is the author, Meg McDonnell, of Tasting the Moon, which is her book on her time and her life with Adida Samraj and in the community of Adida's devotees for many, many years. And it was published in 2010?
I believe so.
Yes. And we're fortunate to have her here tonight to talk about the book and to talk about Meg. So welcome, Meg, and happy to have you here.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you very much for having me here and for persisting in getting me here and for all the good work that you do on Beezone.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to have a conversation with you to get you here. It was quite an ordeal. Meg is a lady on the hill, and she doesn't get off the hill much. So we're very fortunate to have her here because this is a superb book, and I believe there's only 3 books, of my knowledge, on by devotees on Adida. But this book particularly, you're an editor, you're a writer by craft and by training and by genetics. Pretty
Yes.
much your father is a
Yes.
professor at the university. So.
Yeah, my father's a Shakespeare scholar and an English lit prof. Was retired, and then took up a second career as a Jungian therapist. And he brought all that expertise into helping me as the editor of the book. And that was one of the great treasures for me about doing this book, was the opportunity to work with him that way. So.
Yeah, did you initially go to him to edit, or did you go to someplace else, or?
Well, I have a friend who's told me that there's obviously an incredible story, because Beloved Adida is the focus of the story in the book. But he said there's also another story to tell about the writing of the book.
Right.
And that was a long and involved process for me. Didn't happen overnight. I, for many years, had a growing sense of obligation to share the incredible treasure of wisdom and blessings that I receive from Beloved Adida, and to do that in the form of writing my story, the story of my time with him. But it is inherently such a huge challenge to write about him. He's such an incredible being, and by his very nature, so multidimensional, and touched on so many areas of life with such genius that I felt quite intimidated by the challenge of writing about him.
Right.
So I kind of had to back myself into I kind of had to trick myself in a certain kind of way into the writing of the book. So I was well into the process of working on what eventually became Tasting the Moon, when I realized, I'm actually, I'm going to do this, and it's actually going to be a book, and therefore it really needs an editor. And let's see, what editor could I afford on my budget? I know, someone who really loves me.
And I think in the book, in the back of the book or somewhere in the book, you mentioned a lady by the name of Marilyn Ferguson who
Yes.
who you were interviewing or had some conference with, and she was the one who kind of gave you the impetus to actually do the book or do something with it?
Well, I met Marilyn Ferguson, author of Aquarian Conspiracy, which was a very defining and international best-selling and mind-expanding book for a lot of people in its day.
Right.
So I had a tremendous amount of respect for her as a thinker and as a writer. And I had the privilege of escorting her into a sitting occasion with Beloved Adida. And that's how escorting her into a sitting occasion with Beloved Adida, and getting to know one another in that really blessed context. And we talked a little bit about writing at that time, just a little bit. And then later, years later, when I had a fairly well-developed manuscript for the book, I approached her through a friend to ask her if she wouldn't give me input at that point. And there's, I'm not going to say more about it because it's a pretty dramatic story in the book.
Right.
So she had, she had an influence. I wouldn't say she instigated the book. It was already a well-developed manuscript by the time she gave input. But so there's an interesting little interlude with Marilyn in the book.
Very much so. So and the publisher, who?
It's self-published.
Self-published.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, in the beginning of the book, you have a disclaimer.
Yes, I do.
And the disclaimer, I don't want to read it to the audience, but you're just basically saying that this is, of the 3 books that I mentioned, there's only one that's considered an authorized story or conveyance of who he is and what the time with that devotee is. So in the disclaimer you say that this is not been an official word of Adi Dham.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so this is just your experiences.
Yes.
Yeah. So did you ever try in any way to make it official, or you didn't feel a need to do that?
I didn't feel the need to do that. For many years, I had the tremendous honor of being trained by beloved Adida to be part of the team that reviews manuscripts in order to authorize them. And so I feel very well steeped in what those principles are. And he left a tremendous body of work that communicates itself along those lines and is consequently very pure and very powerful. In my own experience, I began to feel that there needs to be a broad range of voice about him. And I began to feel a very personal obligation to share a very human story. And since it's my story, it's a human story, it's a flawed story. And I think there's that Native American tradition in the weaving of blankets that you leave a flaw in the weaving because that's the way the spirit can flow into the blanket. And I feel in some ways that my human flaws that are, I tried to be honest about in the book as best I could, are exactly what might for some people open a doorway to understand why it is that someone would be attracted to have a spiritual teacher, why it would be that someone might be attracted to beloved Adida in specific as a spiritual teacher, what my real human need for him was, and how much I received from him that made all the years with him just so rich and so full of spiritual reward. And I felt that it was important for me to be able to do that in very personal terms, in just very simple and direct relationship with the reader. And I knew that if I felt so many other challenges built into the writing about him, because of his purity, and because of his genius, and because of the incredible power of his blessing, I just didn't feel that I could face the challenge of coming up to expressing those things in some kind of honorable way, as well as exposing my own human flaws and how he served me in the context of my ordinariness, and add on top of that the feeling that I had principals looking over my shoulder, or people who were going to try to apply principles looking over my shoulder, And also, so there was that.
Mm-hmm.
And then also in my own background, when I was younger, my family were all very devout Catholics. So I was raised in a tradition, and I have writers in my background, and I have relatives who've written on both sides of the theological fence. They've written official theological treatises that get the official recognition and endorsement of the Catholic Church. And then they've written other things that are just personal testimonials of their faith, and they don't expect or seek any kind of official approval from any kind of religious body. And so I grew up with this awareness that there are two kinds of sacred literature or devotional literature. One that is an official or sanctioned conduit of the Dharma, and another one that's just personal testimonial. And so I wanted this to be very personal.
Yeah, well, one of the things that really I want to tell you that came through for me is that I always looked to that. I always looked for the human side.
Oh.
And so many books that I read of devotees, it just comes across as just the official word, and it just gets too abstract and it gets too official. It doesn't really get down to the personal matter. And I want to tell for the viewers who are watching this interview, if you want a first-hand raw account, if you will, unedited and undoctrinated with all sorts of other kind of editing from the officialdom, this book gives you the real story. And the style in which Meg writes is just so smooth, and her craft is she's a master at her craft. So,
well, thank you, Ed. That's really a very sweet thing to say.
Well,
it's very wonderful to hear as a writer.
It's true. It's true. And so, you know, it will grab you, and just the style and the way you can communicate, how you communicate. And one of the things that I would like to get to now in our discussion is his presence. Mm-hmm. And I do know that you came out of a generation, just out of the beatnik generation, and your father was a university professor and raised in Ohio and moved to Washington, and then we could get into all sorts of stories. You wanting to not take home ec, and
yeah.
the women's lib in you, you know.
Yeah, no, I've been a troublemaker from the start. That's
but a good
true.
troublemaker,
yeah.
a good troublemaker, you know, breaking the crust off of the culture. But being part of the '60s, being part of that generation of
dinosaurs now is what they call us, Ed.
As Ramdas told me, he said, we're close friends with Ramdas. He said, Ed, I don't know if I'm a relic or an icon.
Yeah. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference.
He said, you're a little bit of both.
Yeah.
But anyway, so you're traveling around, you're in communes, you're doing all sorts of experimental kinds of activities in the 60s, 70s, mostly in the early 70s, and you stumble upon somebody who gives you a book. And I was trying to figure out the book it was. Was it The Method of the Cities?
Originally, yeah. That was the first book that I got.
Right,
yeah.
right. And so then you come down into San Francisco, you start doing the No Remedy class, you become a student of Arida.
Yes.
You're well steeped in the traditions because you've read not just Animal Farm, which is one of the... Because you come into your studies as a young girl with such compassion, with such a sense of the injustice in the world, the suffering of the world, and not only just the suffering of the world, but also your mind is so developed in the philosophical and spiritual dimensions. You're well steeped in the history, and you're not a new student in this. You have done your homework. So when you get to Adidas Community in 1975, 4?
End of 1975 and the beginning of 1976, yeah.
And that was in San Francisco, and they had just purchased the land in Persimmons, I believe.
About a year before, yeah.
A year before.
Yeah.
You're doing the coursework. It's a very a dynamic time down then. The community is really together. And I just want to move into the period when you first had the opportunity, because when we're talking about writing, I'm talking about communicating and how you communicate your first sitting with Beloved as if you could breathe underwater. And I love that.
Yeah.
Could you, just for the audience, give a little taste of what it was like when you first met Adida, aside from the unicycle?
What you mean?
The
Are you
darshan.
asking when I first sat with
Sat
him,
with him.
what the sittings were like?
Darshan.
Well, you know, Ed, that's an interesting question because there were some ways in which his process developed and changed over the years. But there was a much more fundamental way in which that very first moment of sitting with him contained everything. And it was a completely life-changing gift. His communication, silent communication, unmoving communication of a state of being that is universal and transcendent and utterly free and entirely embracing, yet without any difference in the embrace. It's so paradoxical to feel so embraced and so touched so deeply, and yet there isn't someone else apart doing the touching or the embracing. So there's a tremendous response that brought up out of my heart that I had no idea existed. I think some of this you're discussing earlier, childhood sensitivity to suffering and a kind of childhood questioning for me of there's got to be something more than what I'm seeing around me here. And so sitting in the room with him, there it is, the more. And so because that gift of pure being that he miraculously, mysteriously is able to convey so powerfully and so convincingly, just liberated me to allow that same being that I'm not different from to respond, to rush out in liberated response. And I think it was that liberated and grateful and happy response to his powerful, powerful communication of this core or source universal condition that just, I couldn't take my eyes off him. I couldn't turn away from him. He was the only real thing.
Right.
So I don't know if that
Yeah,
answers your question.
Very well. But it's also a universal devotee's response is that he is the supreme attractive force.
Yes.
And so...
so your life becomes an exercise of gratitude then.
Right.
Which is a very wonderful way to live.
But as you point out very well in the book, that there are two sides to that grace. There are
Yeah.
two sides to that light that you say he actually, in the book, he turned his physical form, turned to light. And in that light, the radiance and the power of the heart is felt. But also, as he points out, the light is also a fire.
Yes.
And in part of the process of being in the company of somebody as supreme in that radiance is a purification process.
Yeah. Well, this gets to why I felt the story had to be so personal, because, I had very real baggage that I brought with me into his company, and very real things I needed help sorting out about just being a human being and being a woman, all kinds of questions about life and all kinds of unresolved issues that I brought with me. And I have that initial moment of sitting with him where just this, your whole being rushes to open in gratitude for the revelation that he's giving you. That gratitude has deepened over the years because I've seen, and he used to tell us this, that spiritual force has an innate intelligence of its own. So it works in your life, as you say, like a fire to purify, but it works with great intelligence to bring about the crises and provoke the changes that you actually need to be open and more responsive to receiving what it is that's being offered. And, some of that was so gritty for me, and I have come over the decades to feel so grateful to him for being such a hero in helping me in such specific ways, for being this sublime genius of prior and formless communication of being and bliss. Words fail, but then also to be equally genius at bringing that force into your life and putting you right up against the lessons that I needed, and taking a chance on me by putting me up against the hard stuff. And I just became more and more grateful to him for the intelligence of the process that he continually took me through and continues to.
Right, and while you're talking, I'm reminded that it wasn't always, you never had the full blessing all the time to be in the company of somebody like Adida, who was Adida, but also I'm reminded of you having a period of time when you were, a 5-year period of time, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, almost 6.
Almost 6 years, when you were, for various reasons, not in his, or did not see him. And now, and just to add to that, here he is not embodied. Mm-hmm. So just to put that attractive principle and the gifts that you had, because during that period of time, and I don't want to speak for you, but that was the time that he was doing a teaching demonstration. So a lot of you were very fortunate to be in the demonstration, to learn about
all the crazy experimenting we did with our lifestyle over the early decades. Yes, I feel tremendously grateful.
Right.
I do. I mean, there's a lot of that was experimentation, and so therefore not something you necessarily need to repeat. But so much kind of humanizing wisdom came out of that.
I think he says you must become, this is all about becoming human, but you're also dealing with the first 3 stages of life here.
Well, yes, he was quite firm in telling us that you couldn't achieve the kind of spiritual advancement we all seem to be interested in without first becoming a real human being, right, and taking responsibility for love and work and sex and money and all those things. Not perfecting those things, but having a very basic and generally, in my experience, quite humbling self-understanding, mm-hmm, in all those areas. So, yeah, he didn't divorce the life of the spirit from the practicalities of human life. And I so valued that because I don't think I could have responded to anything that was abstract. I needed what he had to give.
Right. So not only personally, but you were in the company of a true genius
Oh yeah, no question about that.
on any number of subjects and also levels of subjects. And in history time, prior to even, I mean, if I'm not mistaken, he could look at a book and just get it.
Yes. And I watched him do that with people quite a bit too. He said he could read your forehead.
I do know that there were a number of times devotees would hold objects of various people and do psychic kinds of things, but that's really a whole nother topic right there.
Yeah.
But I did want to just talk about that period of time when you had so much interaction and service in his company, not only in California, but in Hawaii and Fiji. So your time in his service, intimate service, covers 33 years?
33 years that I knew him while he was in the body. It
Yeah.
continues, but there were 33 years while he was alive here with us in that particular human way.
And so, just to go back to that period of time when you were, I don't know where you were, but you were walking down the street and you had just, you broke down because you knew that you hadn't been in his company for 5 or 6 years.
I hadn't seen him for really too long a time, and it really broke my heart.
Yeah. So I would just want to take that and then put it into this post-Mahasamadhi time.
Uh-huh.
Without, how has the transition, having been in the physical company of somebody that supremely attractive, and then not then having that, how has that transition been? I would imagine it's quite difficult.
Well, boy, there's just so many different levels that question sparks in me. When he first, after his passing, initially, of course, there was tremendous grief for all of us, I think. It's pretty safe to say. And there is some part of me that honors and respects that was an irreplaceably special opportunity to be in his company that way. And so, but a friend of mine said something that has really stuck with me in the midst of our initial grieving process. She said she got a letter from a Tibetan monk who reminded her, he said, no one ever talks about the late Jesus or the late Buddha because the understanding is that who Jesus is, who Buddha is, can't die, doesn't leave, is eternally present. And so in the years since his passing, there's been a deepening discovery of how true that is. And it's another kind of gratitude. So it's, not to negate how special it was that he was here humanly and that some of us got to actually witness his revelation during that time. But it's part of the reason why I wanted to write the book, because at a certain point it became very clear to me that not one single moment that I spent in his company was given just for me. It was always about his work with everyone.
Which brings up a topic that I'd like to talk about, a photographic session. Now, you don't have to get into the whole detail of it, but he called you in because you had an American look.
Yeah.
This is just one story of how Arida worked on not just one level.
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, as I understand it, maybe you can clarify it. I'm sure you will. And then he picked another woman who had an Eastern look or an Oriental look. Maybe you could share a little bit of that and just how the profundity.
Well, it's really sweet that you bring this particular story, which is in the book, up today, Ed, because today is the anniversary of that photo shoot. This very day. So before I got in the car to drive down the hill to come and talk to you, I emailed my metrics partner and said, "Hey, it's our anniversary, metrics sister. This is, sending love from the west to the east." And we'll, every year we always make a point to connect and celebrate the anniversary of that photo shoot. So that's today.
Wow.
So you were asking something about him working on different levels?
Well, you were pointing to when you were talking about him not being embodied and the work that he did, or always did, seem to be, when he worked with you, we're not just working with you. He was working with, as they say in the traditions, you're a coin.
Yes.
You're an instrument.
Yeah.
That he works, or these.
Sometimes I felt like a piece of kindling that was getting thrown on his fire. You just feed the fire. You're in the process of participating with him. Tremendous, as I was saying, and tremendous insights and purifications and lessons and strengths are given, and they seem in the moment, because of this innate wisdom of the spiritual force that we were talking about, they seem so perfectly tailored to you. But then, after a certain number of years of receiving all these treasures, I began to realize, well, no, this couldn't possibly be just about me. It's not given just for me. It's given for everyone. He's here for everyone. This blessing is for everyone. And how am I going to help everyone,
Well, that's what I feel is the importance of this book.
Yeah.
Is because when I read in that, and I because I'm a student of other teachers also, and it's not unheard of to read in Marababa's books of the work that he does on spiritual levels. And when you're in the photographic shoot and you're bending on this bench and in all sorts of positions, but yet 2 days or 3 days later, reading about the American and the Chinese news reports of what was happening at that time.
Yeah.
I know it sounds fantastic, but when you're in his company, you can intuit, you sense that this is, as you say, you're a kindling for the work that's happening at another level.
At a much greater level than the personal. And, that's always inherent in the blessing communication that he always made. It's personally always perfect, but on the other hand, that perfection arises in the midst of a communication that so transcends the personal. That's always true. But I think his life also, and this gets back around also to something I think you were asking about in this now time after his physical vehicle has passed. He himself, in my view, went through a life trajectory in which he more and more moved in the direction of spiritually working, specifically with a greater focus. In the earlier years, he seemed very concentrated in instructing individuals, and he used that interplay with individuals to build up this incredible body of spiritual literature, because the writings all came out of this, what he learned from these exchanges with, how are people getting off course, what do they need to hear about, what light can I shed. But over the years, he seemed to me increasingly focused in work that wasn't so much about individuals anymore. It was about a world blessing process, and I described lots of stories and details by which that led me to believe this about him in the book. I try to give a very clear sense of the progression that I saw, but so that by the end of his life, his personal qualities and aspects were much more silent and not as full in the same way as in the early years of human interchange, but much more intent on the bigger picture. And again, I try to describe that with some vivid detail in the book.
You do very well.
But I think in going through that life trajectory himself and becoming more and more focused on world blessing and universal blessing, it's paradoxical to say this because it's not that he was ever not doing that.
Exactly.
But it just became more and more of a focus, and more of his personal aspect seemed consumed by that, and so that when his physical passing took place, we'd already had to go through a purification and a letting go of a lot of dependence on human interchange with him. So I think in some ways he prepared us as best he could for that.
Well, I think, I don't know, as early as 88, if I'm not mistaken, and many of the stories in there, he was always pulling away, so to speak, or removing himself from the dependency
Yes.
that the devotee had on his physical interaction,
Yes.
human interaction, because the spiritual force, every person I've ever spoke to, and I did not have much personal time, but every one of them to this day says that you didn't want anything other than to be in that physical company. That was the number one.
Yeah. Well, there's nothing more appealing.
Right.
Nothing more powerful.
Right.
Nothing fear, nothing happier, nothing more intelligent, nothing more interesting.
One of the things I wanted to talk about was a name that he gave you in the beginning, which in many cases he gave names, at least to my understanding, that were humorous and funny, but your name actually became a little prophetic in what he gave to you, and I guess it's all right to give it, but he gave you the name Excellent Phrasing.
Yes, he did.
But he gave the excellent first.
Yes, I got my first name first.
And they all and because one of the devotees asked, "Well, Meg doesn't have a name," and he said, "Excellent," and everybody went, "Ooh."
Yeah, except for me.
And then came phrasing.
Yeah.
So, could you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, well, there's a lot of things to be said about that name and how it changed my life and how it became a form of spiritual help to me at many points that were really important. And I've talked about some of them in the book. I think the strongest thing about that name, because he gave it to me in our very first personal meeting. I had never spoken to him or written to him or made any kind of communication to him whatsoever. I have been in silent sitting occasions with him with hundreds of other people, but this was my first introduction to him. And so before I've said a word to him, he's introduced to me as Meg and asked to give me a new name. And he says, excellent. And then phrasing. Excellent phrasing. And at the time I had the feelings that I had about the name.
Which she talks about.
Which I talk about in there. But over the years, as my work and service to him became focused in editorial work on his publications and writing introductions and writing magazine articles and giving lectures and teaching courses and traveling around the world speaking about him, and I realized that it was a prophecy, or he'd read my forehead and knew me better than I knew myself. It became such a powerful reminder to me that my guru knew me intimately and perfectly from a position that was prior to my having met, prior to knowing me in any human or social context. And it has become such a powerful bond to him. The understanding of his nature and the nature of the guru-devotee relationship that he communicated with those two words, and the kind of lifeline that's been for me for years since. At the time, it just seemed like a fun, thing in the moment, and I didn't know. I had no way of knowing. It took decades to really understand. Oh my God, look what he was showing me in the first moment that we met.
As you said, it's all there in the first moment, even in the sitting, and just the multi-levels of that, what incarnation is and what life is. It's just an enormous, but you definitely point out, and you go probably 3/4 of the book, you return to this, the bookends of excellent phrasing. You kind of encapsulate it, and it shows itself, the genius, and also the incredible psychic nature of the relationship. I mean, on an instant.
Yeah. Well, this is part of what I said was so daunting about sitting down to actually write the story. How do you tell a story of interacting with a being who is operative on dimensions I know? I am sensitive to a number of dimensions on which he's operating, and they're so sophisticated and so interwoven so beautifully and so perfect and so filled with liberating grace. And I extrapolate from that into knowing that there's all kind of work he's doing that I don't have the radar sensitive enough to pick up on. And so any account that I'm going to give has that flaw built into it. And it took a long time to overcome my sense that I could never do him justice. And I finally had to just accept, well, okay, my account is going to be flawed and it's not going to be perfect, but it's better than no account at all.
But I just want to share with you from a reader's point of view, because that's implied or implicit in the reader. Oh, she thinks this is the only story. But I want to tell you, for readers, the last page in the book completely puts that into perspective.
It does, doesn't it?
Does.
Yeah.
I don't know
he gave me a lot of help. But we're not going to blow the punchline.
No, we wouldn't blow that. But I want to tell you, did you hold that for a while? Did you know where you were going with that last page?
For a long time. I was working on the book it took me 6 years to write the book. So I didn't have that held as the last line from the beginning. But probably about halfway through.
It was sweet. It was sweet because it did. If I, as a reader, because that's what I'm reading, I'm listening, and I'm thinking, she's thinking that this is the all and the be all and the end all, and she's got the right end, the right angle on this. But the way you take care of that notion, for any of the skeptics, you do very well.
It was very, as I mentioned, important to me that this story be a personal confession, because I think by confessing my own flaws and my own need for his help and the ways that he intervened to give me the help that I needed is a way that his greatness was demonstrated. And for anybody who's thinking about taking up a spiritual path or relating to a teacher or relating to this teacher in particular, to see, well, what does someone actually get out of that?
Right.
For real. Why would you do it? What do you get out of it? So I wanted that to be very personal. And it was really, in tandem with that, really important to me that nobody feel that I'm taking a position like I got some kind of definitive answer that you can wrap up in a tidy package, or that I represent some kind of authority on anything. I wanted to just make a personal confession. And it was very important. I think almost implicit in writing a book is the automatic assumption that you've got some kind of almost even doctrinaire message that you're trying to convey. And I really wanted to avoid that.
Well, that's the brilliance, I think, what you do in that book. And you definitely underline it and underscore it, and with exclamation points,
Yeah.
if anybody has the sense to continue reading,
Yeah.
that you definitely have that taken care of.
Good.
Very well.
Good. I'm glad to hear that, because that was important to me.
No, you did that very. That's what, you know. As I was reading it, you know, that's one of the things I'm kind of sensitive to.
Yeah.
You know, the doctrinal, let me tell you the way, and everything about the way, and
Yeah.
I found it, I got it, and let me give it to you, and
Yeah.
I'm going to seduce you in this story.
My father helped me a lot with that, because I had a lot of people, or a few people, as I was developing the manuscript, try to help me by suggesting that I need to be clear about what the message of the book was. And every time people would ask me that, I just felt so baffled by the question. And so I would express this to my father, and he said, well, just tell them you don't know, and that's what you're writing the book to find out.
Yeah.
So just as the living of the relationship with him prior to writing the book was an ongoing mysterious process of lessons being revealed, that working on the book was no different.
Well, any author will tell you most of the writing of the book is for them to learn about the subject or whatever it is that they're studying.
Yeah, it puts you through a process in and of itself.
Yeah. It's a creative process. So,
Yeah.
you know, it's not a kind of you already know the end before the beginning starts. I wanted to talk a little bit about the teaching, if you will, because you are such a scholar,
Oh,
and
thank you.
you are on the subject, and you're also very one, you've been taught by the greatest, the least that I know around, or.
That's my view, but thank you, Ed. Yeah.
But you also have done your homework.
Yes.
And
He put me to school.
And he does say life is a school.
Yes.
So,
And life around him was definitely a school.
And he has created this body of work called the 7 Schools of God Talk, or the Great Tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And he also seriously asks his students to study that. And you were a teacher or a presenter or somebody who gave presentations to hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands. On one occasion, there was a couple of thousand maybe. You spoke and taught the Dharma.
Yes.
To his students and to others.
Yes.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about his 7 stages of life. Now, I don't want you to go into a whole big thing.
That's good. Thank you.
But, we were talking about the first 3 stages of life, and
ordinary human development, yeah.
Ordinary human development, and the responsibility in that growth.
Yes.
In terms of specific and general, could you just share a little bit about the development of human development and into the spiritual dimensions of existence? That most people think all they got to do is think about God and they're already spiritual.
Well, it's funny. I came to Beloved from maybe a different perspective than a lot of people. I I had always an interest in the religious traditions. The Catholic tradition was a very strong part, real participation in the Catholic tradition. I have an uncle who's a monk, and my father went to seminary with that possibility in mind before he decided to be a university professor and a family man. So serious Christian practice is part of what I grew up with, and then early on became interested in Eastern thought also. But even with that interest, I wasn't really looking for a spiritual teacher. And it's never really been the stages of spiritual development that have been interesting to me. I had compelling human needs to learn about being loving and being capable of intimacy and conducting myself in a happy way in my interchanges with people. And I think it was that human side of things that those were really the burning questions that I had and that I came to him for help with. So my own personal interest was in seeing how his blessing and his incredible insights about human development and what the most auspicious way for human beings to live is, what the most benign way for us to interact with one another is, that was all what really grabbed me and what really held me close. Now, in the midst of that, because he is a spiritual realizer whose realization extends so far beyond all that, he also not only gave description in his teaching of what the process of spiritual development and the different stages that get expressed throughout the great tradition, he gave those descriptions in ways that are, and made the distinctions in ways that are just philosophically genius. I mean, I just absolutely thrilled to his descriptions because they made so much sense out of how all these differing voices actually are part of a single whole, and he did identify how it all fits together, how it is all part of a single great tradition, how there's a realization that exceeds and completes all of that. And he not only wrote about all that with tremendous literary and philosophical brilliance, but he gave those experiences, inducted me spiritually into many of those states, so that I had the living experience of what practitioners in other traditions, may have experienced or were aiming to experience. I mean, it was a tremendous spiritual bounty of experience and instruction going hand in hand. I mean, it was just absolutely phenomenal demonstration that he made. And so, yes, there's a part of me that just fell in love with his philosophical genius and his spiritual insight into traditions that are beyond the ken of human development. And that was wonderful. But it wasn't the burning interest of mine that brought me to him and that kept me with him.
Well, that's one of the things that I loved about your book so much. It wasn't just the gopis in the Krishna in the tree. I mean, you have a very earth, human, every aspect of that. That's what comes through for me, what I really, really, really enjoyed it. You stayed with your feet in the human world. Although you were definitely given the grace of samadhis.
Yeah, tremendous spiritual transport over and over and over again. Neither deserved nor earned.
Right,
but given.
As he then instructed for you then to be able to speak about, to inform people to.
So today is the anniversary of this metrics photo shoot that we were talking about, and there were the two of us subjects in that photo shoot, and I represent I'm American looking, so he asked me to participate as an icon or coin for the West. And my friend, a Chinese American woman, is Eastern looking, so she was the coin for the East. And in that sense, I'm a good representative of the West, because one of the things that he said, to kind of paraphrase, is that Westerners, really want God to perfect this world, grace to perfect this world. They want things to work out here. And Easterners tend to recognize, oh no, this is all mortal and suffering and changing. We want to be transported elsewhere. And I'm a Westerner. I'm a Western girl. I would prefer that we could, perfect things here. And I know ultimately both of those messages are incomplete. This world is not perfectible. Transcendence is an absolutely built-in requirement, as if nothing else teaches us that, then death should. But it was my appreciation of the tremendous way, he used the phrase grace leans, that he leaned to the human dimension and gave, so much help of this is what children go through as they grow up. And if you haven't gone through that, it's going to be still haunting you this way, that way, and the other way. And this is what you should do about it. And use your relationship to me. And use me this way, use me that way. How to bring as much intelligence and grace into the human world as is possible. So that, as a Westerner, that's been part of my tremendous appreciation of what he's done. So I've never been someone who's prefer to go off and just be in the hall and bliss out somewhere else. I want to see it working out for people.
Because you were given that opportunity at one point to enter into what's called the renunciate phase or community of kind of the esoteric order, if you will.
Yeah.
And you speak about the struggles. That's why I love the book so much. Because here you were, because the human struggle that we all deal with comes through. I mean, you talk about your struggle with having to say no to that, and not to somehow in any way diminish your love for him and your love for what was offered in the whole scope of what you were involved with, but that you realized that this was not your calling, or
it was not my calling.
It was not your calling.
Yeah.
And so
I think writing the book was a big part of my calling.
He seemed to know that you were going to do this.
Yeah, there are intimations, weren't there? Ed keeps wanting to blow the punchline, but we're not going to.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to, but I got to tell you that
you
to me summarized.
Yeah.
It was the gel.
Yeah.
It gelled it. It just fell into place. So I always like the word that Alan Watts said about me of listening. The preface is worth the price of the book. The last page is worth the price of the book.